Jump right in.
Hi, hello, welcome everyone. We're so glad you could all be here. My name is Erica Schwartz. I'm a member of the Shelton Voters Network. We are a nonpartisan group. We're affiliated with the Bridgeport Area League of Women Voters. So again, we're nonpartisan, which means we'll never endorse any party or any candidate. And our whole goal is to help voters and people in the community become more informed about the local government so that they can be more active, more participatory, and so we can all make better choices and make our community better because we all are informed. And I want to thank and welcome our Shelton legislative delegation tonight. State Senator Kevin Kelly, State Representatives Jason Perillo and Ben McGordy. I think we're very fortunate to have representatives who are willing and readily willing to attend an event like this and communicate with voters. Obviously, our group thinks that's very important, so I want to thank all three of you for being here tonight. We really, really appreciate it. I also want to point out that we have Chair of the Board of Education, Mark Holden, in the room, so thank you for being here. Way in the back. And I also wanted to thank the Junior States of America group. This is a national organization with a chapter at the Shelton High School, and the three people who signed you in are with the Shelton High JSA group. And that group is, and correct me any of you if I'm wrong, I think meant to help students become more informed in their local government, state government, national, international, political affairs, that they grow up to be informed, active, smart, awesome citizens. So they've partnered with us because their mission really aligns with our Shelton Voters Network, and that's why they're here volunteering tonight. So the only other thing to say is that when you came in, they probably told you that there were little cards up front where you could write down a question. If you didn't take a card and you have a question, you could raise your hand. Someone will find you and get you a card. Judy, who is back there in the black, was collecting them before. I have them. We're going to use those later to ask our state legislators some questions. So if you do have a question and you don't have a card, they're in the back and someone can give them to you. And the only other thing to say is that we're recording this and it's going to go up on our Shelton Voters Network website. So hopefully you got the card with that website information on it, and we'd love for all of you to go to the website, like us on Facebook, sign up for, actually if you left us your email address, we'll add you to our list, and so you'll stay up to date on local political events in Shelton. So without further ado, we'll turn it over to our distinguished guests. So again, we have State Senator Kevin Kelly here in the middle, State Representative Jason Perillo on everyone's left, and State Representative Ben McGordy. And I'm not going to give long bios for you because I thought it's best to save our time to hear what you have to say. But everyone has an agenda that has bios for each of our legislators on it. So I encourage you to take a look and see all the things that they've been doing and are doing. And to start it off, we're just going to ask each one of them just to give about 5 minutes or so to update us on what they've been working on at the State House in this legislative session. What are their priorities lately? And once we hear what they've all been really focused on, then we'll open it up to questions and have a conversation. So thanks again, and maybe Senator Kelly, you could start us off.
Sure. Good evening. My name is Kevin Kelly. I'm your representative in the Senate, and I think we've all seen in the news for the past couple months that the state has not only a budget deficit this year, but also one built in structurally for the next 2 years. So the big approach that's going on right now is how to run government efficiently and effectively. And you've now seen 3 budgets. You've seen the governor's budget, which basically cut all kinds of human services and safety nets in order to not increase taxes. You've seen the majority Democrats that reinstated the safety net cuts, but also included $2 billion worth of new taxes. And then the Republican budget, which reinstated many of the core services of government, but did so in a manner that didn't raise any new taxes. So those have been the focus. There was a very well-attended public hearing today in Hartford on the Republican budget. I know that over 100 people signed up for it, and we got 800 pieces of testimony. So it was well attended, and a lot of people spoke their minds that we need to right-size our government so that it's something that we can afford. We'd all like, pie in the sky, but if you can't afford what you're paying for, it doesn't work. It doesn't work on your personal budget. It's not going to work on the state budget. We also sit in committees, and I know on my committees I'm ranking on aging and insurance. And in those two areas, particularly with aging, we've done a number of things. One is in the Republican budget, we reinstate the governor's cut on home care, which is a gateway to aging in place. We've looked at restoring many of Connecticut home care program cuts, as well as we just passed this past week in the Senate something that I know the AARP was very instrumental in advancing, which was known as the CARE Act. And it may sound, it's a nice title, but it's a very practical, common sense approach that doesn't cost money. What it requires is that when somebody is in a hospital, the person, and we're going to patient-centered care in our healthcare system, identifies their caregiver that then stays on the record throughout the continuum that the person is on. And the big critical part of this is that at discharge, the hospitals not only give a written report, but they also sit down and either face-to-face or via video, talk with the caregiver so they understand the discharge plan and give them the information and referral sources so that they can have a successful placement back into the community for that individual. It sounds like common sense. It's something that I thought hospitals were doing anyway, but we found out that they aren't. And this is a critical piece of communication that's necessary to help people age in place. So that's where we are with those initiatives. Obviously, when we get going, we'll be talking about more things.
Thank you. And next, maybe Representative Carrillo.
Sure.
Give us your update. It's warm in here, yeah.
The budget is the elephant in the room, so I'm not going to talk about that. Kevin already hit it a little bit. But what I'm working on is obviously the budget, but in addition, there's a very important piece of legislation that really hasn't been discussed all that much, and it's an effort to generate a bipartisan reform for the delivery of health care in the state of Connecticut, both with insurers and with hospitals. It's a big thing. Delivery of health care, health insurance is kind of my thing. So I've been working with Senate leaders on both sides of the aisle to try and come up with a solution that makes sense to sort of balance the playing field between large hospitals and small hospitals and do it in a way that actually helps to lower reimbursement rates, which then lowers premiums, which then lowers health insurance costs for both individuals and their employers. So that's the game plan. We're not there yet. We've still got 4-ish, 3.5 weeks, which in legislative time is an eternity. So a lot can happen in the next 3.5 weeks. Other things I'm working on are actually very discrete things that impact Shelton. One has to do with how retailers are treated and the elimination of some prohibitions in the past that might impact some downtown businesses. And then the other has come through the Finance Committee. I sit on the Finance Committee. It is related to bonding and brownfields. For those who don't know, brownfields are sites that were contaminated in the past that need to be cleaned up in order to be rehabilitated. There is state money available for that. Those are generally competitive grants obtained through bonding, which is borrowing. Shelton has been extremely competitive in getting those grants in the past, but right now we've doubled the pool of money that's available for those competitive grants. I'm not a big fan of just handing money out, but if there's a competitive process by which those applications are reviewed so that towns who can justify the expenditure and can match the expenditure and who can do it smartly are able to do that, I'm all for it. So this is the way we would do that, and I've been working with specifically a legislator from Waterbury who also has brownfields issues and wants to redevelop areas. So we've been working together to come up with some solutions and deliver some more money to communities that can use it. But I'm sure there are going to be questions. I don't want to monopolize time, but thanks very much for being here.
Thank you. And last but not least, Ben Gordon.
Hello, everyone. Ben McGordy. I represent the other half of Shelton that Jason doesn't have, and I do a little bit of Trumbull, a little bit of Stratford, the Roanoke section there. The budget is the big thing. I'm on appropriations this year as the freshman. It's, I guess, a good place to start. You get to learn what the budget is and how all the different departments work, what they do with their money, how they spend it, and all that, which is a big, big situation in the capital right now that we're going through. Basically, in appropriations, we're trying to restore the funding that the governor's taken out of the budget. That's not an easy task. That's pretty much what we're working on a day-to-day basis. Also on environment. Environment was pretty quiet this year. Invasive plant, the bamboo spreading, that's kind of one of the big things that they were talking about. And the nickel deposit for the juice boxes and the pouch drinks like that, they want to put into it. And then ivory, of the sale of ivory from the tusks of elephants and the sort with that. So they're trying to protect the ivory and that. And then judiciary, pretty much marijuana is always on everybody's top conversation. Domestic violence was another issue. And then drones, which is a new thing now that everybody's kind of cautious about. They don't, I don't know if everybody knows what they are. The thing that flies around the air, have cameras on it and stuff like that. So that's about all I have right now. Take any questions you have. I'm going to be go through it. Thanks.
All right, so we have a couple questions already. It's not too late to submit more. And I'll just start going through them. And I guess most of these are not addressed to any particular person, so whichever of you would like to respond can. So the first one is certainly timely in Shelton, given that we're in the middle of a budget process. Is anything being done to address the rising costs of special education that's burdening local school districts and taxpayers?
I'll take that.
For the tuck.
There are two aspects to the funding of education that center really on the state of Connecticut. One is funding that comes from the state of Connecticut, which is educational cost sharing, or ECS funding. Mark Holden knows all about it. So that's the amount of money that the state gets, or that the cities get from the state to offset the costs and offset the property tax burden that come along with that. We proposed a budget that holds the line on those, that doesn't cut back educational cost sharing at all, that doesn't cut the amount of money that Shelton gets from the state of Connecticut in order to underwrite the Board of Education budget. There's always a risk that that happens, but we have not done that, and it doesn't look like that's going to happen. The second thing, in answer specifically to the question, is special education funding. Always a hot topic. Every year, more and more students are designated to be in need of special education services. That can be anything from individualized time in the school system to placement elsewhere, the cost of which, cost of placement and the cost of the transportation can be borne by the school system. Mark, that can be upwards of $100,000? Easily for a student, for one student. That's a lot of money. The challenge we face is that whenever there is an effort to pull back some of those requirements of boards of education, there's always pushback from specifically parents of those students who are receiving those services. So whenever municipalities want to say, it's costing us too much money, we need to take some of that back, we need to quite frankly, A, not provide services to the degree we provide them, or provide them to fewer people, there's obviously pushback on that from folks who actually receive the services. It's a constant battle. Not a lot of progress, quite frankly, is made every year, and Kevin, jump in, Ben, if you disagree. But it's a discussion we have every year. It's a problem that never gets solved. So the question is, what are you doing? We're talking a lot, but there's not a lot of movement. There's very strong opinions on both sides of the issue, and understandably so. Municipalities and school boards because of the cost. Parents of students receiving those services, obviously because they're parents, and they want their kids to get the services they believe they need. So very strong pull at both poles of the issue, and while there's a lot of discussion, there really is not a lot of progress. So that's my message.
All right, we're going to stick with education and stick with one more education question. This one is, Shelton currently rates 156 out of 168 for spending in education, which obviously is a local issue, but Maybe there's a perspective from the state. What do you propose to do to help our town improve its quality of education and encourage more spending? Which might be limited under your responsibilities, but if you have a response to that.
Did you say encourage more spending?
Yes, the question is, so maybe you have a different perspective, but the question is, what do you propose to do to help our town improve its quality of education? And this person, this question thinks that encouraging more spending would do that. So take that question how you would like to.
Kevin doesn't live in Shelton, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, to a large extent, the educational issue is a local issue. As Representative Perillo indicated how it's structured, there is one requirement, which is the minimum budget requirement, which requires municipalities from the year prior to at least fund at that level for the next year. And that's a state rule that requires municipalities to continue funding in that area. And to date, the state has tried to continue maintaining its ECS funding for education. But as far as looking at additional appropriations locally, that is really a local question in the 169 towns in Connecticut.
And what I'll add to that, one thing I don't support, well, first of all, let me say, I don't necessarily believe that the schools that spend the most money have the best student achievement. I don't believe that to be true. That being said, I do not believe it is appropriate to spend one-time revenue on continuing costs. And here's what I mean by that. We have money in the general fund that sits there as surplus here in the city of Shelton. It has been proposed in the past, both last year and this year, that it might make sense to spend some of that money that sits in the general fund for continuing services, whether they be full-day kindergarten, which I supported, or other budgetary items that exist in the Board of Education or the city budget. Those are continuing expenses. But when you fund continuing expenses with one-time revenue, you create in the next year a budget hole. Because that revenue was there, it was spent, and now the only way to generate new revenue to fill that hole is to raise taxes. So what you get is low taxes in 1 year, but if you want to continue those services, you have to increase taxes pretty significantly in year 2. So you basically get sort of a sawtooth mill rate that does impact homeowners. So I would caution local policymakers against using that one-time revenue to fund continuing expenses. Personal opinion.
But from year to year, on a continuing basis, there's a huge surplus, which can be historically counted on to fund education. I think that needs to be taken into consideration.
You're right. There is a surplus, and that's there. 4.8 million. Mark, in the current city budget rolled over into.
Actually,
It's
That's in one.
4.93, but 2 million is coming from the savings account, and 2.89, sorry, is coming from what they expect not to be spent in this year's budget.
So, by the way, thank you. Sorry to put you on the spot. The city continually, every year, to your point, does roll general fund monies into the current year budget. So basically, last year's unspent money gets rolled into this year's, and that happens every year. As long as you're consistent with that, you don't create a hole. As long as you're consistent. But if we're doing $4 million a year, I'll pick a number, $4 million a year, and then all of a sudden we jump into 6 or 7, now you've got a budget hole because you can't sustain that 6 or 7 million. See my point?
Of the 4.89, 2 million is not sustainable. 2.89 is. Okay, because 2.89 is unspent from the current fiscal year or projected to be unspent. 2 million is coming from one-time source.
So that gives a better picture. I don't want to necessarily monopolize time with
Anything
local
to add?
stuff.
I just wanted to add on to that with, I don't encourage overspending, but when it comes to the local Board of Education, their budget really doesn't have anything to do with us on how they spend it or how they manage it. But what we do have at the state is the amount of money that they do get, and that's based on the students enrolled. They get a certain amount for each kid enrolled. When there's less enrollment, there's less money, and that's kind of how that works. But just spending wisely, and don't take more than you need, and don't spend more than you have.
All right, we're going to move to the issue of health. And the first health-related question is, how are things shaping up with the budget, the state budget, with respect to Connecticut hospitals? And how will the legislation on reimbursements impact the smaller hospitals? So I guess, I know Jason Furler touched on this, but obviously it's a question for anybody.
All right, thank you for the question.
They're on public health.
Interestingly,
Yeah.
reimbursement rates. This is specifically a question primarily about Medicaid. Medicaid is the state government program to reimburse hospitals and doctors, basically for folks who don't have money themselves to pay for it, low-income individuals. Medicaid reimbursement rates are based on a percentage of cost. And every hospital every year fills out a Medicaid cost report. And from that cost report, which is basically what does it cost my hospital to treat a patient for this illness, that illness, that illness. And then based upon that cost report, the state of Connecticut, the Department of Social Services, determines what that reimbursement rate to that hospital should be. So the reimbursement rate for somebody who has a heart attack at Griffin Hospital is going to be different than at Yale New Haven, than at Bridgeport, than at Waterbury, than at Greenwich Hospital. Because what it costs in each of those hospitals to deliver that care is different. In Connecticut, interestingly, the hospitals that tend, and this is a generalization, but the hospitals that tend to deliver care at a lower cost are the smaller hospitals. So what I spoke about very, very briefly before is an effort to level the playing field between those smaller hospitals and larger hospitals to encourage is sort of a light word, encourage larger hospitals, force larger hospitals to lower the cost of care, which would create opportunities for smaller hospitals to increase their reimbursement. Because at the end of the day, if you can drive the cost of care at those large hospitals down, if you can encourage Medicaid beneficiaries to utilize lower cost hospitals, not only does it lower the cost of care and lower the cost of care for the individual, well for Medicaid there's no impact, but it lowers the cost of medicine for the state of Connecticut because the state of Connecticut is bearing that full cost. So the goal right now is to balance that out because there's actually quite a difference. I'm not going to quote numbers. There's quite a difference between high-cost hospitals and what they're reimbursed and the lower-cost hospitals what they're reimbursed. It's much lower, and again, those tend to be smaller hospitals. Does that answer the question? Whoever asked.
Yeah, I just wanted to add in, even when we look at the larger hospitals, the costs that they're looking at that the federal government pegs were costs back in the 80s. So you have hospitals like St. Vincent's that back in the 80s had religious personnel in the hospital that weren't drawing a paycheck, so the cost to deliver a service was much lower. So you may have a procedure at St. Vincent's that's only half what they're getting reimbursed at Bridgeport for the exact same procedure. The other thing too is that when we look at this issue, this is a very complex issue because it's not only about healthcare, it also deals with employment. But when we look at Medicaid and Medicare, the reimbursement rate for the procedure is low. We say it's 50, maybe 60% of value. The private insurance that somebody walks in with is going to pay about 130 to 140% of the cost for the same procedure. Okay? So what happens is the more people you have on Medicare and Medicaid using services, the more pressure you're going to put on individuals with private insurance, which is one of the drivers of increasing health care. Now, a few years ago, the governor imposed the hospital tax on many hospitals, which has been a significant pressure on the good quality regional hospitals, the Griffins, the Norwalks, the Milfords. These hospitals are all having difficulty surviving because of the tax that the hospital tax is taken out of their operations. And this is, I know, what Jason had pointed to earlier, there is an effort right now to look at hospitals, looking not only at the financing, but the quality of care, so that we do have a sustainable, quality healthcare system that's accessible and affordable. Not an easy task to do. There's a lot of moving parts in that. But as you saw earlier in the year, you have St. Francis and Waterbury. They're on the precipice of closing down, and they're looking for somebody to come in. And, that might be the beginning of something that we don't really want to see. So we need to look at hospitals and not only how the insurance deals with this and the payment of services, but to make sure that they're quality and accessible in the regions. Because as Jason pointed out, there are the smaller hospitals that are doing very well as far as quality at an efficient price.
Yeah, I'm sorry, just to piggyback on that, Kevin talked about the fact that government reimbursement is lower than the cost of care and private reimbursement is higher than the cost of care to hospitals, and it sort of offsets. As you lower the reimbursement rates from the government, that obviously drives up the cost from private insurers because the hospital needs to, at a bare minimum, break even at the end of the day. And sort of the perverse inverse situation used to be that hospitals understood they had to ask for increases from the private insurers like Aetna and Anthem. And the private insurers like Aetna and Anthem knew they had to pay more because the hospital still needed to stay in business. That, of course, drove up premiums. But then, corporations, companies that were contracted with these insurers finally said, I can't absorb another premium increase. I can't do it. So the employer started pushing back on the health insurers. And then the health insurers went back to the hospitals and said, look, I get that we're supposed to pay you more money, but we can't do it anymore. It's over. We just can't sustain it. So when you drive down government reimbursement, it used to be you would drive up that private reimbursement. But now private reimbursement is saying, no way, I'm not doing it anymore. So now what happens? Hospitals lose money.
All right, sticking with the theme of health, however you want to categorize this. This question is, I think that cannabis and industrial hemp should be, actually, oh, it's not hemp, it's really bad. Cannabis and industrial hemp should be legalized, and the question is, when will this happen? Will this happen and when
I know
will it
this
happen?
question. I was at another panel with it at one time. I won't even skip it. It's a work in progress. There's people for it, there's people against it, and it's not recognized under the federal constitution as legal to sell. So it's got a lot of issues yet before I think it comes out in our state. So probably not this time around.
Yeah, how many years ago was it we approved medical marijuana? Voted for that. 2 years. A couple of years ago, we decriminalized small amounts of marijuana. That was very contentious. Legalizing entirely is a whole different ball of wax, and I'm not sure Connecticut's ready for that. And when I say Connecticut, I mean the residents of Connecticut. I don't hear a huge cry for it. I mean, there's philosophical arguments for and against, but I don't hear anybody banging down my door saying, gee, life would really be a lot better if we could get free pot.
Perhaps that's a call to action for some
Maybe.
people who really care. They should knock down your door. Sticking with the theme of health, I represent school nurses in Connecticut. We're asking for your support for House Bill 6796, which is recommendations of the School Nurse Advisory Council, and House Bill 7023, which is minor revisions to the Education Status Section 4 screenings. Can you give us your thoughts on school nurses and health in Connecticut schools?
Kevin and I got an award from the school nurses a few years ago, Donna, so how's that for you? I'll speak to the School Nurse Advisory Council bill. I voted for that in committee, and it's reasonable, and I think there's support out of the Public Health Committee, pretty much on a bipartisan basis for that. I'm not 100% sure on the other bill off the top of my head, to be honest, but that first bill you discussed.
I got stories for you.
Okay, thanks.
Can you elaborate on what you voted for it, so you must...
Oh, I'm sorry.
Or we can have the question writer.
A component of it was, I don't want to call it ratios, but it is kind of ratios of students to school nurses. it is a ratio that, oh, is this a cheat sheet?
It is.
Thank you.
And I don't remember exactly what those ratios are, but essentially there would be a guarantee that any school system would have no greater than X number of students per one school nurse. In looking at them, quite frankly, and I had checked with, I don't know if I called you Mark or I called Freeman Burr, the impact to Shelton there would be no financial impact to Shelton because we already hit those thresholds. I don't know about the rest of the towns in your guys' districts, but for ours it would not have had an impact.
Yeah, most of the towns in Connecticut, I believe.
There's only a few that fall outside.
Are already there. The other one dealing with nurses, I know it's not school nurses, but I think it was Senate Bill 285 that dealt with staffing in hospitals and having minimum standards. You know, as we look at quality health care, what you also want are quality outcomes. And part of that quality outcome is dependent upon the healthcare provider and who's there with the patient as the services or the follow-up are going through. In school-based environments, I mean, obviously, I think school nurses are there. They're the eyes and ears to make sure that kids are making, you know, immunizations and things like that. But also in hospitals to make sure that we have the quality personnel there and the loving and guiding hand to make sure that people are doing what they're supposed to be doing. So I voted in favor of 285 last week, and we'll see when these come up. I'm sure I'm voting in favor of those also.
Yeah, and interestingly, I think back to when I was a kid, and my perception of what the school nurse did, my grandmother was a school nurse, but was basically Band-Aids, and if you're sick to your stomach, you sort of hang out for a while in the nurse's office. And Donna can tell you, it is not that anymore. It is not that. You know, there are students with very complex health issues that need to be managed, and in a lot of school systems, particularly in the more urban ones, for a lot of these kids, the school nurse is their only exposure to primary care at all. So you know, the days of school nursing being an easy gig, I'm not saying it ever was, but at least the perception was, it's certainly not the case at all.
Okay, we're going to move on to transportation. This question is, the state has been approved for a pilot of a toll program, and maybe if that's the case, you could elaborate on what that is. And the question is, are tolls definitely coming to a town near ours?
Not if I can help it. I think what we need to start focusing on first is that Connecticut, I don't think, has a revenue problem. We have a spending problem. Okay? Every year since I've been elected, I go up. The first year I went up was January of 2011. Every single January, I go back to Hartford and we're in a deficit. You know, the end of every year we have a balanced budget, but every year we've got a deficit because our government can't live within its means. Now, the thing that I always find that is interesting is that in all of our lives, if we didn't live within our own family budget, kitchen table economics, if you didn't balance your own budget, you wouldn't own a home, you wouldn't be able to meet your bills, you wouldn't be able to do things for very long. Let alone, in my case, being there since 2011 for the past 5 years, not paying your bills and always being in deficit. But this isn't something that's just been, you know, the past 4 or 5 years. I know you've been there longer. I think the state of Connecticut has been spending beyond its means for decades. It's far too long. So the first question is, I think that. Let's try to get our arms around our budget and our spending. Then look at the revenue side. Now, as far as tolls, the 21st Senate District also includes Stratford, which was the scene of why the tolls came down. Okay, it was a fiery crash, and my predecessor, Doc Gunther, was a leader in bringing tolls to an end in Connecticut. So when we look at this issue as far as transportation, what we need to do is look at, you know, can we do this on our own? And the first thing is the governor can't lay his hands off the Special Transportation Fund. We pay the highest gas taxes in the country. Okay, except for where? Wisconsin, okay. But we pay some of the highest gas taxes in the country, and that's supposed to go into roads and bridges. But we aren't putting it into roads and bridges. As a matter of fact, we're sweeping the account and throwing it into the general fund. And when he does talk about transportation, he'll actually say, yes, we have put, his administration has put more money into Metro North than any governor in the past, I don't know, 8, 10 years. He's right in a sense, okay? But if I asked you, what's the first thing we should do in transportation? You'd say, let's make sure that the rail and the roads are safe. Fix the potholes. Let's maintain what we have. We're not doing that. Instead, what we're doing is we're building new train stations in West Haven, in Norwalk, building a bigger and better one in Stamford. So we're adding more capacity to a system we can't maintain. We should first maintain what we have. Make sure it runs, make sure the bridges in Norwalk don't get stuck open, so that we can get people back and forth to New York. At one time, I think it was about an hour ride from Stratford to the Grand Central. Now, it's an hour and a half to an hour 40 minutes if you're lucky, and sometimes it's more like 2 hours. That puts this end of Fairfield County that much further away from New York, which makes it more difficult for a commuter, not only losing time driving or riding the rails away from their productivity in their job, but more importantly, on the way home, they're away from their family and children. So there's a huge cost.
Assuming that you had a parking space,
It's assuming you had a parking space. Correct.
legal.
The only thing I'll add to that, talk about Metro North. Ben and I have been friends a very long time. A few years ago, he and I went down to New York City for the day, and I had not ridden Metro North for a number of years, not since I worked in New York. And the car we were on, there was a big sort of cutout hole in the floor that I swear to God, it was held together with,
Duct tape.
it was held together with duct tape.
It was more than half the size of the table, the spot on the floor.
Very reassuring,
Size.
very reassuring.
So,
So to Kevin's point, let's fix what we have before we start coming up with.
Oh, yes.
I'm sorry.
and going back to what the senator said, I just found out recently, that with Metro North, there's 4 tracks, 2 north, 2 south. 2 of the tracks haven't worked in many, many years. So now it's 2 lanes in, 2 lanes out of Manhattan, which is unexcusable. That's a real problem. And as for the tolls, I was born and raised in Greenwich, and we had the tolls down there as well as you had in Stratford. And as people came into the state, they would get off the arteries, the exits, and clog up all the town arteries to bypass the tolls. To see that happen today, it would just be a disaster in some of these towns. Now Greenwich has grown so big, you can't put the cars there. But I'm not in favor of tolls, but if we were to do tolls, the electronic type where you just drive right through, you get the easy pass through your license plate. But then with that, you gotta give us something back, either remove the gas tax or the, our income tax. Give us something back, but you can't take more money and just keep everything. So that's all I have on that.
Okay,
Is it true that the federal government gives Connecticut some reimbursement because we don't have tolls? I did read
Yes.
that somewhere.
Yes, we
Yes.
Is that a significant amount?
do.
I don't know what the figure is, but that's one of the things that you have to look at is, if we're gonna put tolls in, and I'm not saying I would be in favor of them, but you have to build the tolls, and then there's a loss or a reduction in the amount of federal dollars we get, because we get the federal money because we don't have tolls. So if we start to do this, then we risk that, so it may become, neutral. The only difference is, instead of getting the rest of the country to pay our tax, our tolls, you're going to ask the people here in this region to do it. Should we?
yeah.
Okay.
Keep
Yeah,
us-
the concern there is this pilot program, at least what I read about it, is that it wouldn't make any cuts in transportation funding that we get, the reimbursement that we have now. And my understanding is it's supposed to, being sold as kind of like a traffic diverter, that you raise the cost of the toll to ride on certain roads during certain times of the day to try to get people to go to work earlier or leave later or whatever, to try to alleviate the congestion on the highways. That's how it's being sold. I don't know if you have any additional insight on,
No, that is the way it's being sold.
Okay.
And once again, you know, we have policy choices. And, you know, it's a way to regulate congestion. One of the issues I've been looking at since coming up to Hartford in 2011 has been the Waterbury line. You know, we talk about choices. The governor funded with $600 million the busway from New Britain to Hartford. Okay, it's a 9-mile stretch. Okay, $600 million. Now, it was done right on the old commuter line from Hartford to Waterbury. So what it did was two things. One is it took away an opportunity to reinstate the Hartford to Waterbury commuter rail, as well as from Waterbury down to Bridgeport. Okay, so we foreclosed that, and the Waterbury line is now suffering. But we could have done both. We could have opened up the Hartford to Waterbury line and the Waterbury to Bridgeport line for a little more than half the cost of that 9-mile stretch from New Britain to Hartford. So we talk about, we point to this new tolling mechanism is great for congestion. It's going to alleviate congestion and I'm going to say modify behavior. But wouldn't it be also smart to get people in their commute sooner? People from Seymour and Derby Shelton that have to come here rather than go down to Stratford or Fairfield or Bridgeport to get a parking space. Well, that just clogs up Route 8 and then the 95. And I mean, anybody tries to drive down in the morning, what happens? Right there, down, once you get to Main Street, Lindley Avenue, starts to back up, and if you're going south, it backs up at 27A going the other way, all because of Route 8 jamming in. Why aren't we looking at congestion here and not spending $600 million for 9 miles? I think what we're looking at is, once again, the problem that I think we started with is that we're looking at another source of revenue, tolls, and this is the justification to have government get into our pockets in another way.
Yeah, and congestion pricing has been tried in other states with some success here and there, but who either does now or has commuted to Lower Fairfield County? A couple folks. A lot of other people in that traffic with you. If an hour and 45 minutes to Stamford doesn't make you change your driving practices, make you leave half an hour earlier, $2 isn't even. So I just don't see the impact of that in relieving congestion. The other thing I've heard about for people who justify tolls is they say, well, you know, everything's electronic now. It's not that expensive. You don't have to pay somebody, you know, to be there to collect that ticket or that $3. But you know, let's be honest though. You know, the folks at Easy Pass aren't doing this because they're nice guys. You know, they're getting some money on this thing. So it's not as cheap as people might make you think.
Okay, this one might be a quick one, or maybe not, what do I know? The question is, what airline is being, and I think this said counted, but I guess, what airline might be coming to fly from Bradley to Europe? Will they redirect flights from Bradley to points in Europe?
He's trying to get Air, the governor's trying to get Aer Lingus.
You like
So
that?
Aer Lingus might be coming, is
Yeah,
that
I would
the
echo
story?
that.
Okay.
Possibly.
Possibly, he's trying
Yeah.
to, but he's,
It's Aer Lingus stuff, isn't it?
Aer Lingus, he's
Yeah.
offering.
and JetBlue those things subsidized?
There, I believe there's some sort of incentive.
I can't see how there's enough traffic to pay for it, enough ridership. But in fairness, I don't have the numbers in front of me, so I can't necessarily state that.
Well, they did have a nonstop flight from New Haven to Chicago, which was wonderful because it was 2 hours and it flew in the morning and came back at night, and it was great for commuters to Chicago. And you get to Chicago, you can go anywhere you want. And in Bridgeport, they had flights to Newark, which when you get to Newark, you go anywhere you want.
So far, not yet direct to Europe, so I guess stay tuned and possibly Aer Lingus or JetBlue is what we're hearing. Okay, so we're going to totally switch directions. This question has a little bit of a sort of a preface to it. That says the governor's budget included a provision to increase liquor store hours of operations. Package stores can open Monday through Saturday, 8 a.m., Sunday at 10 a.m. At farm wineries, the earliest they can open is 11 a.m. Obviously, farms with pick your own start earlier, be it pumpkins or Christmas trees. Why can't the farm wineries in Connecticut have the allowance to match the hours, have the ability to match the hours of the package stores, particularly because some are already open with customers on the property making other purchases? So what's your view on wineries being able to open as early as liquor stores? Or farm
No
wineries?
problem with that.
Yeah, my personal opinion is, I see no difference. If you're selling wine, you're selling wine. Where you're selling it from is immaterial. What is the pushback on that? It's something that comes up all the time. It doesn't gain traction. I see no issue. I see no issue. That was easy.
So I guess someone needs to work with the legislator to propose a bill. I mean,
Oh, it's been out there.
It's been
Oh,
out there.
yeah, absolutely.
It was an environment for,
so does this
but it
ever
went
come
out.
up for a vote? I mean, does it just not have enough push behind it to
It
move?
was something called brandy too, it was a brandy.
Yeah, it was
Brandy, and there was
built in with
honey, and then wine, all in that, it was all in that bill, I remember.
Yeah,
It
all
passed
all
out,
farm-
no problem.
farm and farm winery issues run through the Environment Committee, but
Yeah.
that did come out.
It did come out of
Yeah, that was
committee.
voted out of committee, so the
Yeah.
bill is alive. The question is, where does it go from here? Does it go anywhere?
So I guess that's another call to action. If people care about it, there is an active bill, and they should contact all of you and all their friends with different legislators to tell them to do what they can to advance it and vote yes for it.
There's also, I know we had this last week in the Senate, allowing farm markets to sell craft beer. So that passed the Senate, it's going on to the House.
I'll let the Shelton Farmers Market know.
Right, there's slightly new farmers market this year. So these are a couple of opinion questions for you that, to be fair, don't really relate to your work in Hartford. But they're good local questions, so we'll just get your opinions. The first one is, do we really need a new city hall in Shelton?
I mean, my personal opinion, I think the first step is there are two different blocks. There's, how specific do you want me to get? I'll try to thread the needle. There's two different blocks. There's the block that has the Birmingham building and, the Pierpont building and the firehouse, that's one big block. And then there's the block that has the post office for the parking lot and the building that is now burned down, that whole block. What I would advise is that we start on that block that has the building that burned down and has the parking lot. You start your economic development there. You work with private property owners to build revenue-generating property. To build that revenue-generating property. And from that, you do that all the way around that block, and then you push yourself over into the block with the firehouse and the post office and the probate court and all that. Now, for the most part, all of that along Forum Avenue, from the probate court to the post office, is government-owned right now. And it is not as conducive to retail use as is Howe Avenue and Center Street. So I do actually support movement of City Hall to that location. And then from there, the space that currently houses City Hall, which is, Ben spends quite a bit of time there, is woefully ancient. Then the city has an opportunity to sell that. But I do support a new City Hall, basically on city-owned property right now. And the post office and the federal government is considering selling that.
I would just add, I work in City Hall pretty much most of the day. It is old, it was a school, it's time to move on. We've outgrown it, we're even at the Lafayette School now. It's, most in every town hall's right on Main Street. Everybody goes there, they get their dog license, their motor vehicle tax, property taxes, planning and zoning, they're visiting all these groups. They park their car, they do their business, they go next door, have lunch, go across the street for coffee or do some shopping, whatever. We're set up there on the hill, they park, they go back home. They go to that side of town, because they drove all the way over to this side of town to go. If it was downtown here, people would shop. More people would come down, businesses, I think, would thrive if you put City Hall right in the hub of everything.
Yeah, and part and parcel of that city, any city hall structure that would be built there would also be additional parking, most likely underneath. So you get 1, 2, perhaps even 3 levels of parking, maybe not 3, 1 to 2 levels of parking there. And we often hear that there is a parking problem downtown. That's another way to alleviate it.
With the old city hall, you could turn it into either condos or the hospital next door, maybe branch out over into it.
There's a lot of
something
options there.
Yeah.
Does they would charge you for parking though, wouldn't they, downtown?
Not necessarily, especially if it's government owned, any government owned property, just like the post office parking lot. One of the first things the mayor did when he took over was get rid of, back in the early 90s, was get rid of all the paid parking, all the, for those of us who've been around for a while, the meters all came down. So there's been a government commitment here in Shelton not to charge people for parking, and I would hope that would continue.
Okay, and we're not going to have time to get through every question, and I was hesitant about if we should ask this one, but it's very timely. So again, it's an opinion question, which is, what is your view on the prom dress situation that's currently in progress at Shelton High School? And Senator Kelly, again, this might not be a question for you because you don't live here, but if you have a brief opinion on, and I'm guessing everyone in the audience is familiar with the dress code. There was a debate over
Can I start with this one?
dress code for prom dresses. So a brief opinion.
I'll start with this one. I have a senior in high school, not at Shelton High, she goes to St. Joe's. But she is going to prom this Thursday, and she shopped for a prom dress, probably pretty much took about a year. And she purchased one online, and she got it out of China. It was inexpensive, but this dress is unbelievable. The way it's made, it's crafted, it's heavy, it's good materials, not like stuff that is around the stores. She didn't like it because it wasn't exactly what she ordered, but it's similar. So she went out and she purchased another. They're both very conservative dresses, but it is very important to a teenager in high school, senior, and a junior too. Their prom dress is it's their big night, it's their dress, dress appropriately, but it is a big situation, and I know, Dr. Smith has her hands full right now with what's going on with that, but it's important to the girls, and, keep it clean, that's all.
In my opinion of this, my daughter is 15 months old. And in following all and looking at the pictures, she's not going.
Is this the pink socks?
Yeah, you like those?
Yeah.
Okay. Those were quick responses, that was good. Okay. Lost the next question. This goes back a little bit to education, and if you're able, you might want to fill some people in on this. I know a little bit about this, but not probably enough to fill in. The question is about what is the status of the lawsuit against the state of Connecticut regarding the education cost sharing, which Governor Malloy has twice postponed. And I don't know if that has to do with the charter school issue. Is that with that or not? And maybe this covers old ground that we've already covered.
No, I think what you're talking about, isn't that the CJEF litigation?
Whoever wrote the question wants to expand.
My understanding was regarding education cost sharing, which many cities and towns have been woefully shortchanged in this general part of the state. Okay, I grew up in a color-coded map, and I know that Woodbridge, and Sonia, Derby, and other towns in this general area are getting seriously shortchanged. My understanding, there was a lawsuit against the state of Connecticut. Governor Malloy postponed it past election day to January, I think, and now he's postponed it somehow through his lawyers to September. Last I understood, it was coming up in September.
I'll ask Kevin a question, so everyone here. Is Phil referring to the lawsuit that basically required the state of Connecticut to bear the entire cost of?
Well, that's when I mentioned CJEF.
Okay.
That would be that the state constitution guarantees everybody
Right, I have my terms
an
mixed up.
education. And so, at heart of that was the Sheff v. O'Neill case,
Right.
which towns and cities were supposed to move toward but haven't. And then this was going to bring in that constitutional guarantee.
Right.
But to my knowledge, it hasn't moved too much further than where it was.
So it's still in September then, to the best of your knowledge?
Yeah, I'm not even that, I mean, I know that he was postponing and there were some I'm going to say preliminary briefing that I think the plaintiffs were having trouble with the state, but I haven't followed the litigation that closely.
Okay.
But I know that it's not, moving forward and there's an argument before the Supreme Court or something like that coming along.
Thank you.
Okay. The next one is about, if each of you could answer, how do you respond to constituent contacts? Someone had an experience with Rep. Perillo's office where he didn't get a response. But how do each of you respond when a constituent contacts your office in any number of ways that they might do that?
First of all, I'm sorry about that. Second of all, it depends. If I get 10 emails, they're all exactly the same, on the exact same issue, what I do is I draft a response to all of them, and we all have legislative aides, and I have my aide send that same response to all 10 people. Generally, anything else I respond to myself. My aide forwards them to me, and I respond from my personal address.
Yes,
And if something fell through the cracks, I'm sorry.
Representative Perillo, if I might address that issue, I've had an issue with your office that should have come to closure a long time ago. I think it's indicative of poor response to constituents. I didn't receive a list of electric generators from UI. So I called UI. They said that list has to come from PURA. So I called them, and I got someone there who is a supervisor who didn't have an answer to that question. So I said, but he said, well, I'll get back to you with an answer. I says, oh yeah, state employees need to get back to me with an answer on this question. So I says, well, we have a Republican representative, Jason Perillo. Perhaps you could ask the House Republicans to do research and come up with an answer to this question. And the person I spoke with was Alicia Marcolini. So I spoke with her, no response. Several days later, I spoke to her again, no response. In the meantime, the supervisor did call me back with a response that answered the question. But I do think a response from your office would be warranted. So there was a third time, again, several days later, I contacted Alicia Marcolini. Oh, we'll get a response to you, some answer to the question shortly. Nothing.
Well, for that,
Finally, let me finish, please. Finally, a fourth time, I says, well, maybe to bring closure to this question, I need to speak directly with Representative Perillo. She says, I'll leave a note and a message for Representative Perillo to call you back. Never heard from Representative Perillo. So to me,
let's have him respond, and then maybe you could talk with him afterwards about it.
let me finish.
Well,
No, I'm actually gonna- I'm gonna
let's
interrupt.
give him a chance to respond. I mean, I think we
Well,
all
I have to finish
understand.
my question. So I'm waiting for a response from Representative Perillo. So to me, that poses two questions. It's either gross incompetence or arrogance, one of the two. So that concludes my remarks.
Thank you, that was very kind. My aide is Alicia Marcolini, and you're beating her up, and she's not in this room to respond to your concerns. So let's you and I talk offline so we don't spend everybody else's time talking about the lunch.
Why don't you respond publicly to the question?
I'm not going to take shots at my aide, who's not here to have a conversation with me.
Why
or
don't you
defend herself.
respond to the question of a lack of response?
Well, I think he responded with how he responded. So, I mean, that was his response. You can be dissatisfied with his response, but I think he
Yes, I
gave-
am dissatisfied.
Yeah. So, but why don't we move on to the other two people? I think Rep. Perillo responded with how he tends to respond when constituents call his office. Your experience obviously was not
Well, I'm glad you
satisfactory.
clarified his remarks.
So why don't we hear how the other two legislators handle constituents contacting their offices?
Yeah, I mean, we welcome comments and input. What we try to do is, depending upon what the circumstance is, if we get a lot of email, we send, like kind. If you're writing to me as an email, you're probably going to get an email response. If you phone, we'll get an aide back to you to follow up, or we'll put you in place with the people, like if you have Pura, put you in contact with people who can answer the question. We try to answer all the questions. If somebody calls, I get calls on my cell phone at the house, There's even a phone in my basement that on occasion people call. And we try to get back to them as soon as possible from when they call, but sometimes there is a delay because they don't go down the basement every day to that area and pick up and check the phone. But we try to get back in like kind to the way the response came in. So if you communicate telephone, you get a call back, or an email if you send an email, a letter if you send a letter.
All right, Mike, I just want to take a quick check here before I answer that. Okay, my number is on. Okay, as far as Jason and the senator, so we all have aides, we get emails. Being new at this, I was overwhelmed with emails right from the start for every committee I'm on. Hundreds of emails on domestic violence, 100 on the gun bill, hundreds, and then at the end of the day, you have 1,000 emails. You got to pick through who's sent by some organization, who's sent from a true constituent, and you know, some are real. Some we even get ones from overseas that want to give us thousands of dollars because we won the lottery. But it's a lot of stuff. It's a lot of emails, and a lot of them don't pan out. A lot of people are made up names, and you know, you respond to some of them and some you don't. But all our cards I know are in the back. Our names are there, our numbers are there, our email addresses. So, you know, if you get it, it gets to us. I'm sorry, some maybe do get lost in the mix, but there's hundreds of emails on topics a day that we get emails on. So one or two maybe get dropped. Sorry, but.
Well, one of the things, many of the, when you go to the sites and it's like a form and it shoots in, that will come in, but we can't many times respond back because it's screened by the organization that's sending it in. So we get the input, somebody says vote no or vote yes on whatever the initiative is, but we can't respond back that, yes, I've got that and I understand your view, or I got that and I'm not going that way, I'm going a different way. But there's a screen on it and we can't communicate back.
Okay, thank you for that. And this event was also co-sponsored by the Connecticut General Assembly, so I think you have to push, and sometimes obviously the response isn't always what you want, but I think if you push and you seek to engage, I think we've made clear that we want our representatives to respond, and so if they haven't been to the extent that they wanted to, hopefully they will do that or continue to do that from here on. So the next question, it relates to, I think, transportation and development in the downtown. And the question is there help to Shelton on the Worcester Street crossing, and that would be needed to push along downtown development? Can any assistance come from the state to move this forward?
I can answer that. There is some money that has actually already been made available from the state of Connecticut to Shelton. It's a 100% match, so 50% borne by the state, 50% by us. The money isn't the thing that slows that crossing down. It's actually the federal government. The federal government gives very, very broad and deep control of private rails to the owner of those private rails. Neither the state nor federal nor local government can compel the Housatonic Railroad to reopen that crossing. Can't force them to do it. They have absolute control over it. So until we are able to work through the Department of Transportation and the Housatonic Railroad, it's going to be a little bit slow until that gets done. The three of us, along with Mayor Loretti, met with DOT Commissioner Rediker about this exact topic a month and a half ago, 2 months ago. And we have his commitment to help us move this forward. But it is, you would think, well, heck, just open up the barriers and open up the road. But there's an awful lot of federal law working against us on this.
Okay, and again, a little more transportation. When the Route 34 bridge construction is complete, can the southbound traffic pattern remain with the contiguous flow off the bridge? And I assume that means, where right now you can kind of go over the bridge.
I like
you don't
that.
have to stop. You kind of just,
I use that. I like that.
you just
So I
keep
hope
going,
it's-
and you don't have to wait at that next leg to get onto like,
Yeah.
Route 34. Is that what the question was? So, And you guys perhaps don't make those traffic decisions, but do you have any insight into that?
Yeah, we definitely don't make those decisions. What I've been told is that that is the plan, is that that's part of the reconstruction, and that traffic that's taking the right onto 34 to head to New Haven, that's going to continue without that light. But again, I'm not the guy making that call,
Does the
so.
person that wrote that like that term? Yeah.
I think it's awesome.
It's so much easier, so much easier.
Just keep going.
Traffic
Okay.
flows.
Here's a question, someone's asking about some factual information, perhaps with the question seems to have an implication of an opinion maybe. What is the state population versus, the state population change from 1990 to 2005, this says, or 2015, versus state employees? So the change in state population versus the change in state employees, 1990 to 2015.
I cannot give you a specific answer, I will give you a very broad answer. The number of state employees has gone up, the number of state residents has gone down. And it's pretty alarming. I don't know the exact answer.
You know that's my question.
I do now.
I came here 30 years ago from Greenwich, a little liker, and my understanding was that the state had 19,000 employees then on the books. I asked the Governor Malloy at a meeting like this last year, are we now up to 50? I was taking from the stuff that you guys printed, 52,000 now, and we've had the state population go down 1 million. He said that's all lies. We have about 42,000. I said, all right, if we've lost 500,000 people, why do we have twice as many people working for the state, A, B, and I understand it, we can't fire 10,000 state employees if we wanted to, true or false?
How did we ever survive with 19,000 state employees? We made it work somehow.
It still takes me an hour to go through a DMV.
Oh, I had something really good to say too. It was really smart.
Jason.
Somebody bail me out.
19,000 employees.
But that's why I was talking before, that we have a spending addiction. That's our problem.
Ask one more question, but I'll try to shut up. Is not the cost of the state employees either number one or number two biggest cost on your chart of state expenses?
It's significant, both the
Is it
cost.
number one or number two? Would you guess?
Are the pensions in or out?
I have no idea, just a simple text
I
there.
bet you it's number one.
It's number one.
Number one.
And then the other large expense is social
I think
services.
that's the elephant in the room, because Connecticut has a tax worm.
Well, this is what I was going to say, so this is going to be great. When you think about it, it's like any other beast. You feed the beast. So the more money we get, increase the sales tax, create an income tax, raise the gas tax. The more money the government class gets, the more creative ways they find to spend it. And that's what's happened here in Connecticut. We did fine with 19,000 employees and no income tax. The line was just as long. And here we are, 25-ish years later, and not any better, but it's an awful lot more expensive. To your point, you're absolutely correct.
Same amount of highway.
But one of the things, let's talk about 30 years ago. DSS spends about 25% of the state budget. That's human services, Medicaid. Okay? That 25% of the budget is spent on a circa 1985-86 COBOL-based computer.
I don't even know what that is.
It actually broke last summer, and it put the system down for about a week. It only took a day to get the system back on track, but it took that long because they had to get somebody out of retirement because there was only like one guy in the state that knew how to fix this thing, and bring him back. And the problem was, how do you get a retired state employee back into service to let him go back to retirement without dealing with his pension benefits?
Yeah, the problem wasn't getting them, the problem was the paperwork.
Right. But this is the thing, is we've increased the size and cost of government, but we haven't made it any more efficient. It's not like we're investing into our infrastructure.
We all understand that.
Right, no, I know the people in the room get it. I know my constituents get it. The problem is we don't have enough of you in Hartford with us. Because there's just a disconnect.
On that same piece of paper, I asked the question from Jason, I haven't got an answer yet. The state unemployment welfare fund went broke, and the state, we are told, small business, got a loan of $689 million from the feds about 6 years ago. And then it couldn't pay principal, and then it couldn't pay interest. And now we're doing what, Al Capone called vigorish. Now we're paying interest on the interest. As the state, which says it has a balanced budget, paid off that $689 million? Or do you know?
I don't know. I don't
I
believe they
thought you were in
did.
charge of finance.
No. They said I was ranking on aging and insurance.
Okay, so is that, I don't want to cut off the answer if there's more answer to that, but no? Okay. We're going to have one last question. It's heading towards 8:30. And the last question is looking forward to the future, so there's a lot of...
I have a question.
We didn't get to all the questions.
It was pertaining to a state tax, and I think that's more important than gowns.
Which question was
The
yours?
veterinary, the proposed taxing the veterinary services, veterinary.
Okay, we'll do two more questions, yours and the other one. So the question is, what are your thoughts on a proposed tax on veterinary care?
Well, once again, we spend too much. But with regards to veterinary services, the thing here is that every time you put a cost on doing business in Connecticut, which a tax is, it increases the cost of the service. And that's actually a luxury issue. Many people find that, discretionary of sorts. And so when we put taxes on those types of services, not only are we going to put, pets in harm's way, so to speak, we're going to start losing jobs. Because people aren't going to be able to afford the service that we have. And this is just, it's true of veterinary services, it's true of accounting. They're looking at all kinds of services because, once again, size of government keeps getting bigger, we don't have enough revenue, we got to find new sources, and so this year it happens to be veterinary services.
Well, like Malloy, he's, pseudo cutting the state sales tax by what, less than 0.5%? So that, he's trying to make that look like it's a big deal for constituents, which it's, who's going to realize that? It's pennies.
Well,
But then he's sneaking in all these other taxes. It's going to cost taxpayers way more, and it's going to, from a personal point of view, of course, it affects us. But the bigger picture is people aren't going to be able to afford, they're barely affording vet care now.
Right.
The animals are going to end up in the shelter. The animals are going to suffer. It's going to cost taxpayers more in the end by euthanizing them or having them caring for them in shelters. So it's a ridiculous thing, so I'm hoping that you will vote against it.
I think everybody here is against that initiative. And, it's once again, what are we doing? We look at what's going on and we continue to put more taxes on people. Right now, we're purportedly in the 6th year from the Great Recession. We're in the recovery, but this doesn't really feel like a recovery. And when you start to see what the government's doing with slashing a lot of services and looking at more revenue, well, what happens the next time there's a downturn? Okay, we got to get our fiscal house of order under control in the state, and it clearly isn't. And coming back to the good people of Connecticut and the people that actually, we should be thanking people that will be willing to put a key in a door, turn the lock, open up a business and say, hey, I want to work here and I want to employ people. And putting the cost of services, the sales tax, which by the way, with the governor's cut, generated more revenue. not because of that idea that lowering the sales tax is going to spur more growth and purchasing, but because we took away a lot of the exemption and put sales tax on other services that weren't there. So, you know, it's the unemployment fund, that back on small business. And all these, the costs of insurance, all these things cost, and the cost of doing business becomes more costly. It's why our unemployment rate is nagging. Why aren't people coming to Connecticut? But they do come to Shelton. Why? Because the Shelton tax base has 20 years of fiscal responsibility that has a solid and stable tax base. People that come and do business here know that when they come and do business here, they know what the tax structure looks like. How come in a state where that is just not happening, Shelton can flourish? Simple fact. The state of Connecticut, for the past 20, 30 years, has not had its house of cards in order, as evidenced by the comments over there. So this is what the state of Connecticut needs to do. Make itself more predictable and stable. Have a tax structure that people understand what's going to happen. And then the companies will come and invest here, bring their jobs, and bring their wealth with them.
The state has like the number 2 in per capita wealth in the whole 50 states.
Well, I don't know if either of the other legislators want to respond, because actually the last question was going to be, what might you do to keep businesses in Connecticut and help young people coming out of college who are still struggling to find work, find jobs? So maybe it's sort of ties.
I'll talk to you.
If people want to stay, we could run a little later. I thought we'd try to
I have
wrap
a
up by
question that wasn't answered.
Let's get this
All right, we got a question on the floor.
question.
Well, let me just finish my one comment on the veterinary thing. Today, I don't know if you know Doctor, and I don't want to destroy his last name, Sheldon Yezino?
Yes, I
Okay.
know him.
He came up today with his veterinarian group. They testified today. They were number 4 on the list with the group of veterinarians that came up from the finance thing. So they had a good presence today in opposition to the tax on the veterinary service, just to let you know that people are up there fighting it, so. Okay, that's it.
Thank you.
Yeah, and in answer to the question about job creation in the business environment, until you do in the state, essentially what Shelton has done locally, which is keep taxes low enough to attract business, you're not going to see a change in the statewide business climate. People come to Shelton. They come here to start a business, they come here to work, they come here to live. But they're not coming from North Carolina, they're not coming from Massachusetts, they're coming from Stamford, they're coming from Greenwich, they're coming from Wallingford, they're coming from towns, and don't quote me on those towns now. They're coming from towns that have a higher cost of living, generally with higher taxes. They're coming here. So if the state of Connecticut adopted the tax model that we have adopted, which is to lower taxes across the board, it would attract more businesses and more workers, and would provide more opportunities. I don't know why I'm pointing at you. And would provide more opportunities for folks, young kids, who go to school here and live here and have their parents here and would like to stay here but can't find a job here. It would provide those opportunities.
Why doesn't the government get that?
All right, well, we do have 2 more questions, so that means we will cover all the questions, and if people want to stay another few minutes, obviously if you have to leave, you're free to do so. So your question I think might end up being the absolute last. I'm going to do this other one first. I suggested that a will should be delivered to the judge of probate for safekeeping prior to somebody's death. Is there any action on this?
Not that I know.
I have not seen this.
Just as a, I mean, I'm a lawyer, practitioner in the area of elder law and estate planning. The issue that you would have with that question is that the will, although executed on the date you sign it, isn't actually given effect until the day you die and it's admitted to probate. So for instance, I could have signed the will today, and you know, if that was what we thought was the will, we'd take it to the probate court, but then next week I sign a new will, that changes everything, well, does that go to probate court too? I mean, but it's the last will prior to death that the courts look at.
But wills disappear an awful lot.
We talked about this.
Yeah.
Yes, we've spoken about this before, not you, Ben, you were here, Mr. Miller was there.
Yeah.
And I personally have been ripped off on a will that was in my favor and just disappeared, so the previous will had to take. I was in that will, and it almost happened another time, but I was able to correct that. And another time, when we spoke about this at a public meeting with the same three except for Ben, Mr. Miller was there. There were 12 people in attendance, and unbeknownst to me, there were 2 others in the back of the room that stood up and said the same thing. They had been ripped off because the will that was in their favor disappeared. And it can't disappear if it's at the judge of probate's office, and you can change it whenever you want to. And the state of Vermont has had this for over 20 years, and they love it. You don't have to put it in the judge of probate's office, but you can if you want to. You can even charge for it, maybe make it $2.
So, now actually a question for Kevin. So why couldn't that be an option? I guess the problem that you would run into is if somebody, in their last waning hours decides they want a new will, there wouldn't be time to file that. This is just me talking, I'm thinking out loud. There might not be time to file with the probate office. So, at the end of the day, if you have a hybrid where you can file it, but you don't have to file it, what breaks the tie?
Well, the other thing too is if it's not mandatory. I mean, like, my practice is we hold it in a will vault. We keep also what's called conformed copies. Because in the event something should happen, I also have it electronically executed, and I have a hard copy in a will. So unless, like, this part of Connecticut sinks into the sound, we're going to be able to get our hands on a conformed copy of the will and recommend to the court that this is the reason why the person may have lost the will. The long story short on this is that if it's, I'm going to say voluntary, you could do that now by going to a law office that has that capacity to hold on to the document, or make sure that the document is there.
I did that, and my lawyer moved to Florida. So much for
Lawyers.
Okay, so I assume this was your question, 'cause it's the only one I have left. I'm sorry, thank you. Has anyone you know ever had trouble getting dental care? And I guess this is a question about access to
Kind of
dental
thrown it
care.
out there, yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want me to expand on it?
No, I mean, I know exactly what you're talking about, because there's always been a challenge with access to dental care. The question is, what's the cause of the access? Particularly in underserved communities, lower income communities, there hasn't been that access. Is that because there aren't enough dentists taking Medicaid as insurance to cover that dental care? Is it because there is an absence of education to those communities about whether or not they should access dental care and or where they should access it? All questions that, depending on what side of the issue you sit on, changes your answer. There's been a push in Connecticut to change the scope of practice for dental hygienists. There has been some movement in that area. It's been expanded a touch. I know that hygienists were supportive of that, and the thought process is...
I will vouch that I am a hygienist and an educator, so I can speak to that.
So there has been some move in that direction. It's not 100% of what the hygienists have wanted in terms of a full-on expansion of their scope. But
It's what we asked for. It's already in development.
there were earlier versions that were much more aggressive than that.
It's actually the same bill. But what we have, it is, I was there both times. What we have right now is, we have data from Minnesota that to back up it working. We have HRSA's report came out that we are health provider shortage area, many areas of Connecticut, so we have that data. We have 13 other states that have proposed. This is for an advanced dental hygiene practitioner who would have some limited restorative capability. We would not be working independently. We would be working in collaboration with a dentist with an agreement. We already have collaborative agreements with our public health dental hygienists now. We have the curriculum in place. The scope of practice is well defined. It's there. I mean, everything that we need for it is there. We now have it as part of the bill. It's already been made an amendment, and I'm asking for your support on it. There was a recent report from the Connecticut hospitals. Every single hospital, their needs assessment, problems 1, 2, and 3. It's either 1, 2, and 3 in every single hospital in the state of Connecticut.
Yeah, my
Dental.
understanding on that bill, and I'm going back a number of years now, there were versions of the bill that didn't have the collaborative agreement component.
It may not have been as well defined, but we know what has worked and what is
But
working.
even
We
my
did ask for
understanding
it,
is
so.
even the dentists are on board with this now, so everybody seems to be on the
I
same page.
hope that they are.
I-
There
that's
are
what I've
ones
been told.
that are
That's
not.
what-
The dentists in Minnesota are, in the facilities where they've been working, they're asking for more of them. We have 52 countries that have this. It's based on the nurse practitioner model.
Yep.
We really have our ducks in a row with it, and we're asking for your support on it. I can vouch for the fact I've been an educator for 10 years and a hygienist for 38. And we have students that are willing to enroll tomorrow. There's no fiscal impact. It's a master's degree education that they're willing to spend the money for. And we have community health centers that are willing to employ the advanced practitioners. It would be less expensive than employing a dentist. We have many community health centers that can't get dentists. And the access to care issue is not just access, it's utilization. And the utilization issue is putting the hygienists where the people need them. We work with older adults. We go into nursing centers, adult daycare. We have portable equipment. We can practice without a dentist now, doing our own scope of practice, but with the increased scope of practice, it would be the same.
Yeah, as long as the collaborative agreement is there,
It's,
it's pretty cut and dry.
yeah, it's pretty solid.
What's the bill number?
It is substitute House Bill 6814. And we have the Minnesota report on file. It's all there, pretty organized. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And, do we have
I have one.
one final question?
One final. So, this is to all three of you. As a business owner in Connecticut that moved from Florida, I would ask the three of you to tell me, or everyone here who's a business owner, what we might expect in the future as to the business climate here in Connecticut. I know you guys touched on, there's a spending problem, and that's obvious because taxes in the state that I came from are half, and there's more services. So I mean, it's just as they go brain surgeon to figure out there's an obvious problem, but in Florida, I grew a business to one of the largest architectural manufacturing companies for signage in the country. Here, I look to spend my money in other areas of commerce outside of Connecticut because I'm petrified at what I see here. So what would you say to that?
How do we put a silver lining on the cloud? I don't want to blow smoke. If we continue on the current trajectory, I'm very concerned that that trend is not going to turn around. And we discussed a little bit about how changing the tax environment, changing the regulatory environment can have an impact. Guys, disagree with me if you think I'm wrong. I don't see legislation moving in that direction.
Not with the current makeup of the General Assembly. And that's, corresponding, and I think one of the best things you saw this year with the governor's budget, okay, one of the few things he has to do is put a budget that's balanced and under the spending cap. He did neither. It's out of balance and it's over the spending cap. And he kicked it to the legislature. And what that says is that the governors aren't the people who really adopt the budget. It's the General Assembly. just like Congress, we have the power of the purse. So it's the General Assembly that sets the fiscal policy of the state. And look who's controlled the General Assembly for the past 30 years. It's really been one party, except for, I think, 1 2-year stint in the Senate. That's who's been running the show. So that's a big problem here, and I can't say that I didn't get involved. You know, I appreciate the fact that you actually brought a business to Connecticut, and I'm thankful that so far you've stayed here. But the problem is we aren't making it an environment for more people to do that. And what we're doing is we have one of the best educational systems in the country, and we're putting our money into that investment. But then all those kids leave. He's got a young daughter, you've got a senior, I've got a sophomore. I have a 12-year-old too. And I didn't get involved to see a government mortgage. I mean, I know our futures have been mortgaged, but I didn't want to see that happen to my kids. And I don't want to have to go to Chicago or Dallas or Los Angeles for Thanksgiving, because that's not where my grandkids are going to be. I want them here in Connecticut. But I know where we're going, the road we're on, and the road we've been on for a couple of decades, where we've been, you know, a decades of decline, is not a positive one. Now, that's I'm going to say the dark cloud. The better cloud that's out there is, and I think what we've demonstrated with the Republican budget, is that you can actually fund core services. You can actually make investments in transportation. You can actually look at educating our children and making sure that we take care of the vulnerable. And you don't have to do it with raising taxes. It's just setting priorities and spending within your means, which is something everybody does in this room on their household budget. And it's amazing that if we could do it in our household budget, why the same people that do it at home can't do it in Hartford. But for some unknown reason, they don't do it. But what we need to do is start to look at, well, how do we keep the investment we're making in children to stay here? Part of doing that is to make sure that we have people willing to make the sacrifice and to take the risk of opening up a business, putting the key in the door every day, and not only making wealth for the company, but also providing jobs to people in our community and giving them an honest wage that can afford a mortgage and can buy cars and the services and the things that we need, and turn things around that way. So to an extent, thank you for doing what you're doing. I know I got involved to make sure that we could change the government to go on that road. And sometimes I do get frustrated because I think like the voters here in the 21st Senatorial District get it. They want that. But, you know, in other parts of the state, we're not quite there yet, but we are making headway. We've picked up a number of seats in the House this past year. We picked up another seat in the Senate. I think we're going in a right direction in that way, and we're showing an alternative. There is a better way. To the 30 years that have been, that the road we're on has not worked for us. We've invested millions, billions of dollars, and we're still performing not very well in creating jobs and putting middle-class families to work. We're demonstrating that there is a better way. Our budget's doing that. So we're giving people in Connecticut a choice. The hope is that they see that choice. They recognize that the Republican vision is going to put forth a commitment to maintaining core services, but to do so in an effective way that people can afford. So that's what I think is the good news.
Good, 'cause you can keep my grandchildren on Monroe, because that's where they are.
Well, I cover Monroe too.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I just want to thank all three of our legislators for being here, for taking the time. Obviously, they're busy people, and it really does mean something, I think, that you're here to communicate with us, and that's very important. So thank you. And I thank all of you, and I invite you again to visit our website, to like us on Facebook, and to look for the emails that you'll be receiving about. Mostly we focus on things just in the city of Shelton.